Imagine the Earth, a single lit match hovering just above a barrel of nuclear gunpowder. That was October 1962. We were closer to complete human annihilation than at any point before or since. In history books, the resolution appears clear, a triumph of American resolve and strong leadership. But that is the lie we were told. The real lesson of 1962 was not about who blinked first, but about a terrifying, humiliating concession that was kept secret for decades. The bombers were airborne. Soviet subs were armed. Minutes later, the calculations predicted millions dead. John F. Kennedy wasn't posing for history. He was a young, exhausted man confronted with the literal end of civilization. The decision came down to this: risk everything for public honor or secretly pull back for global survival. On that fateful October 28th, the world rejoiced when the USSR agreed to withdraw its missiles from Cuba. But what the White House offered in return, away from the spotlights and the public eye, was the true price of peace. What did Khrushchev actually take home? What was the secret deal JFK authorized that truly prevented the end of the world? And why was this terrifying lesson from Cuba hidden from us for so long? That search for the truth leads us back to the most perilous day in human history, a day when the Earth spun on its axis under the shadow of a nuclear mushroom cloud. For 13 days, the fate of civilization hung by a thread as thin as a single miscalculation, one impulsive order. No one slept. In the subterranean bunkers of Washington and Moscow, the rhetoric was war, and the contingency plan was total annihilation. While diplomats spoke in carefully measured tones, the military moved closer to the brink, believing conflict was inevitable. The world paused on October 28, 1962, waiting for the final, irreversible command. The official history celebrates the unwavering firmness of John F. Kennedy, the glorious victory of courage over communist intimidation. The narrative of triumph was clean, simple, and satisfying. But while the globe exhaled relief at the public withdrawal of the Soviet ships, a darker, more instructive truth was being forged in a secret pact whispered in the dead of night between the Kennedy brothers and the Soviet messenger. To save the future, Kennedy did not merely demand, he yielded. He traded missiles in Cuba for American Jupiter missiles in Turkey, NATO's critical doorstep. This concession, guarded as the Cold War's dirtiest secret for decades, reveals the true lesson of Cuba. Survival required the humility to retreat, not the arrogance to win. If the world was saved by a compromise kept hidden, what happens when humanity's most vital lesson, the necessity of mutual concession, is intentionally erased from the history books? That question leads us back to the abyss of 1962, a time when history was not written by lessons learned, but by the calculation of sheer, unblinking terror. This was the era of mutually assured destruction, MAD, a doctrine so cold, so logical, that it threatened to annihilate logic itself. The world was a chessboard balanced on a razor's edge, where the pawns were nations, and the only consequence of checkmate was oblivion. The two titans, the United States and the Soviet Union, faced each other across ideological battlegrounds, each finger hovering perpetually over the red button. They did not understand compromise. They only understood power projection. And it was this fatal lack of empathy, this zero-sum rigidity, that set the stage for the closest brush with extinction humanity has ever faced. Into this volatile theater stepped John F. Kennedy, a president barely 2 years into his tenure, still burdened by the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion that had left a permanent scar on his authority and fueled Khrushchev's perception of him as weak. Kennedy was young, charismatic, driven by an idealism rooted in peace, yet acutely aware that survival required him to play the cynical game of brinkmanship. He carried the unimaginable weight of the free world, but also the relentless, hawkish pressure of his own military advisors, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These men were trained for victory, not retreat. They saw negotiation as capitulation, and they demanded a swift, violent response to any Soviet aggression. Kennedy was trapped. Preserving global peace required a flexibility his generals would interpret as treason. On the opposing side stood Nikita Khrushchev, loud, erratic, and driven by a fierce, almost parental need to protect the communist outpost of Cuba. Khrushchev was obsessed with correcting the strategic nuclear imbalance. He viewed American Jupiter missiles placed in Turkey, right on the Soviet border, as an intolerable threat. Placing his own medium-range nuclear missiles just 90 miles from Florida was his cosmic provocation, his desperate attempt to force the world to see the threat through Soviet eyes. It was a crude, brilliant, terrifying gamble that instantly destabilized the global order. When aerial reconnaissance photos confirmed the missile sites in October 1962, the terror became tangible. American cities, Miami, Washington, New York, were suddenly minutes, not hours, from annihilation. The crisis wasn't confined to the high-ceilinged isolation of the Oval Office. It permeated every household, every school. People dug shelters, studied evacuation maps, and waited for the sound of jets they knew might signal the end of everything they knew. The global breath hitched, paralyzed between the arrogance of two superpowers. For nearly 2 weeks, the confrontation hardened into a terrifying binary choice: retreat or war. The military solution, an immediate invasion of Cuba, was clean on paper but guaranteed nuclear retaliation against NATO allies and potentially the US homeland. The path to salvation, the lifeline that history would almost forget, would not be found in conventional military strategy or public pronouncements. It demanded a deviation from the script of absolute victory. It demanded a sacrifice, a hidden compromise that was too politically expensive to ever admit. This was the seed of the great forgotten lesson that saved the world, the necessity of mutual concession, even under the blinding spotlight of global conflict. It fell to Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and indispensable confidant, to navigate this impossible path. He was the only one allowed to bypass the official rhetoric and establish the secret back channel, a desperate line of communication built not on dominance, but on recognizing the shared fundamental fear that united both leaders. October 27, 1962. Black Saturday. The rhetoric had failed, the blockades were failing, and when a single American U-2 surveillance plane was shot down over Cuba, the hardliners had their final bloody justification for war. The fuse was lit. All that separated humanity from global fire was the thin thread of trust being spun in utter secrecy. The next 24 hours would define the fate of the planet, hinging on a gamble no leader dared admit he was taking. The dawn of Saturday, October 27, 1962, did not bring clarity. It brought a paralyzing silence, the kind that precedes the breaking of the sound barrier or the catastrophic shattering of worlds. Kennedy, already in the crucible of the White House, understood that the silence was merely the cessation of conventional options. The previous days had been spent formulating ultimatums, but this day demanded a final, terrifying answer. The room where XCOM met, the Council of the Condemned as some darkly joked, had become a claustrophobic pressure cooker where cigar smoke and exhaustion hung thick in the air, mirroring the leaden hopelessness settling over the strategic map of the Atlantic. Every strategy debated was met with the same terrifying counter-argument: guaranteed nuclear response. An airstrike meant Soviet retaliatory fire against US bases in Turkey or Italy, which meant American retaliation against the USSR, which meant inevitably the end. They were no longer strategizing victory. They were calculating degrees of apocalypse. The historical weight of the moment crushed the men in the room. They were no longer politicians, but custodians of human survival, and they were failing. Then, the fragile silence was violently broken. The news arrived raw and immediate, cutting through the diplomatic fog like a shockwave. A U-2 reconnaissance plane piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson had been shot down over Cuba. This was not a typo, a glitch, or a miscalculation. It was an act of war. The military machine, built and trained for decades to react to such provocation, surged forward, demanding immediate, overwhelming retaliation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were adamant. The time for talk was over. Kennedy, staring at the map, fought the urge to give in to the righteous fury. He knew responding to a single downed plane meant triggering the irreversible cascade, granting the war machine the fuel it craved. Simultaneously, Moscow complicated the situation with a brutal diplomatic maneuver. They sent two messages, one private, almost desperate, seeking a conciliatory path that involved only Cuba, the second public, broadcast across Radio Moscow for the entire world to hear, demanding the explicit removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey in exchange for the withdrawal from Cuba. Khrushchev had publicly raised the stakes, turning a discreet, face-saving negotiation into a confrontation designed to humiliate Washington on the global stage. The Soviet premier essentially declared, "We remove the dagger aimed at you only if you remove the dagger aimed at us." This was the zenith of the crisis, the true moment of decision. To refuse the public demand meant escalating directly to war, as the U.S. would appear weak and unwilling to trade. To accept the public humiliation meant political suicide and the collapse of NATO alliances, which relied on the appearance of unwavering American resolve. The official position was zero negotiation on the Turkish missiles. The world's diplomatic rulebook offered no path forward that didn't end in fire. But the rules of the nuclear game had changed. They were no longer playing checkers. They were balancing on the edge of a razor. And it was here, when logic failed and institutions froze, that the true lesson of 1962 began to emerge. A lesson rooted not in strength, but in calculated humility. Enter Robert Kennedy, the president's indispensable brother, operating in the shadows. He recognized that the formal public positions were merely armor. The underlying truth was that both leaders were terrified men caught in a trap of their own design, desperately seeking a way out that preserved their domestic power. Following his brother's mandate, RK traveled to the Soviet embassy, carrying not an ultimatum, but a fragile olive branch, the secret deal. The United States would officially ignore Khrushchev's public demand regarding Turkey. This part was crucial for Kennedy's survival. Unofficially, privately, if the Cuban missiles were dismantled and withdrawn immediately, the obsolete Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which were already scheduled for removal, would be taken out within 6 months. Crucially, this had to remain a secret, a ghost concession, forever denied by Washington. The fate of human civilization hinged on an oral promise, delivered in the dark, circumventing the rigid dogma of statecraft. It was a wager on Khrushchev's desperation for peace over his need for public victory. The offer was transmitted across the perilous Atlantic cables. The world held its collective breath throughout Sunday morning, October 28th. The silence returned, heavier and more loaded than before. Every minute felt like an hour, every hour a century. The clocks in the White House ticked towards what felt like midnight. Then, shortly after 9 a.m. Est, Moscow radio began broadcasting. Khrushchev was speaking. He announced that the Soviet Union recognized the terrible risks of nuclear confrontation and had agreed to dismantle and withdraw the Cuban weapons. Relief, sharp and overwhelming, coursed through the White House. The war was averted, not by overwhelming military force or successful brinkmanship, but by a quiet, secret act of necessary human compromise. The world stepped back from the abyss, saved by a ghost bargain. The immediate relief masked the profound understanding that settled upon the leaders. The old metrics of power no longer applied. They had stared into the void and seen that victory was synonymous with mutual destruction. The greatest concession had not been the missiles in Turkey. It was the abandonment of the belief that either side could truly win a nuclear war. The price of survival was not strength, but the humility to compromise under the cloak of secrecy, a lesson that would define the Cold War for decades to come. But that secret, that critical moment of weakness and necessary human failure, was only just beginning to unfold. Yet the resolution reached on that Sunday morning was not a declaration of absolute victory, but a fragile, desperate bargain struck in the deepest shadows of geopolitics. The history books recorded that Nikita Khrushchev blinked first, bowing to American resolve, and the world breathed a sigh of relief, celebrating the young President Kennedy as the triumphant hero who stared down nuclear annihilation. But this triumphal narrative was a necessary mask, a deliberate deception crafted not just to maintain the credibility of a superpower, but to preserve the delicate, fragile foundation of the agreement itself. The true victory of October 28, 1962, was secured by a profound act of political vulnerability. The secret promise made by Robert Kennedy, ensuring the withdrawal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey within months. These missiles, obsolete yet strategically provocative, were the mirror image of the Soviet threat in Cuba. For the U.S. to admit this public concession, to show weakness or parity, would have been political suicide for Kennedy and risked the wrath of NATO allies, potentially tearing the delicate truce apart. This secret exchange is the core lesson of 1962. It was not brinkmanship that saved the world. It was the courage to retreat, the wisdom to concede a private internal loss for an undeniable global gain. Khrushchev needed a face-saving exit, and Kennedy, facing unprecedented political pressure, provided it, accepting a secret compromise that history would interpret for decades as pure, unadulterated strength. This required a unique kind of leadership, one willing to sacrifice the optics of perfection for the reality of survival. The men who came closest to ending the world ultimately chose vulnerability over vanity. They realized that when the stakes are the existence of human civilization, doctrine must give way to pragmatism, and arrogance must yield to humility. In the aftermath, the fear remained, palpable and chilling. Humanity had peered over the edge of the abyss and saw its own reflection in the mushroom cloud. The Cuban Missile Crisis broke the illusion of control. It birthed the hotline, a direct link between Washington and Moscow. A desperate infrastructural acknowledgement that never again could the world rely on telegrams and guessing games during moments of ultimate existential threat. The silence surrounding the Jupiter missiles became the foundation of a nervous, prolonged détente. It was a covenant of secrecy, a shared knowledge that both sides had compromised, both sides had failed their ideological hardliners, and both sides had, by sheer human will, chosen life over ideology. The shadow of that secret concession stretched across the decades of the Cold War, a constant, unspoken reminder. The day the world was saved was achieved not through a heroic declaration of superiority, but through a quiet, necessary political lie. And in that lie lay the greatest truth about the nature of compromise when faced with the absolute end. The tension ultimately ceded, but the peace secured that day was not merely the result of public defiance or the visible retreat of Soviet ships. The world celebrated Kennedy's steadfastness, oblivious to the true, humiliating price of survival. The vital lesson of Cuba was not found in the perceived public triumph, but in a profound, hidden sacrifice. The secret arrangement, brokered in the shadows by Robert Kennedy and kept quiet for decades, demanded that America dismantle its own Jupiter missiles positioned in Turkey. To avert Armageddon, to stop the lit match from dropping onto the nuclear powder keg, the West was forced to make a concession it would never publicly acknowledge or accept. This secret act of retreat redefined courage. 1962 taught us that true leadership was not about winning the stalemate, but about recognizing the shared vulnerability of the opponent and accepting private defeat in the name of universal life. This is the solemn truth behind the title. The lesson that prevented the end of the world was the willingness to negotiate one's own glory. The men who stared into the abyss that October gifted us the darkest rule of survival. For civilization to continue existing, pride must be the first weapon withdrawn. That is the haunting understanding that still defines our world.